$20,000. That is the approximate cost of a single long-range attack drone used across the Middle East in the past 24 months. On the other side of that equation, a $13 billion U.S. aircraft carrier strike group, protected by some of the most advanced radar missile defense systems and electronic warfare platforms ever built. And yet, defense analysts are no longer asking whether these two systems can interact. They are asking something far more uncomfortable. Stay with me, because the real story is not that drones can damage high-value assets. The real story is how a low-cost, mass-produced system is forcing the most powerful navy on Earth to rethink how it operates in confined waters like the Persian Gulf and surrounding chokepoints. In the next few minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly how this cost imbalance works, why it matters, and what it reveals about the future of naval warfare. By the end of this, you will understand a structural weakness that is openly discussed in defense circles, but rarely connected in a way that shows its full implication. This is not about a single country or a single system. This is about a shift in the math of warfare itself. Because when a platform that costs tens of thousands can force defensive responses costing millions per interception, the equation begins to change. Not gradually, not theoretically, operationally. And if you understand where this trend is heading, you begin to see why regions like the Strait of Hormuz are being watched more closely than ever. The number behind this imbalance is coming. But first, you need to understand the environment where this dynamic actually plays out. There is a reason military planners from Washington to the Persian Gulf are paying closer attention to low-cost drone warfare than they were even 5 years ago. And it is not because these systems are individually unstoppable. It is because the economics behind modern defense are beginning to shift in ways that are becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. In the next few minutes, I am going to show you exactly how inexpensive unmanned systems, operating inside one of the most strategically sensitive waterways on Earth, are forcing changes in the way carrier strike groups think about risk, positioning, interception costs, and operational freedom. By the end of this video, you will understand why a system costing tens of thousands of dollars can create strategic complications for platforms worth billions. And the most important part is this. The issue is not simply the drone itself. It is the ratio. Because once a military is forced to spend interceptor missiles worth hundreds of thousands, or in some cases millions of dollars, to neutralize systems that cost a fraction of that amount, the pressure stops being tactical. It becomes mathematical. Read that again slowly because the implications are serious. This is not a theoretical discussion anymore. Over the last several years, U.S. naval operations in and around the Middle East have increasingly had to account for drone saturation threats, fast-moving unmanned systems, and the possibility of persistent low-cost harassment design not necessarily to destroy a carrier group, but to complicate its freedom of movement. That distinction matters a great deal. Because historically, aircraft carriers were designed around the assumption that technological superiority and layered defenses would deter most conventional threats before they became operationally significant. But asymmetric warfare does not operate on the same logic as conventional warfare. That is the part many mainstream discussions still fail to connect properly. The question is no longer whether a single drone can overpower a carrier strike group. The real question is whether repeated low-cost pressure, multiplied over time and geography, can force the world's most advanced naval assets into increasingly defensive postures inside strategically narrow waterways like the Strait of Hormuz. And to understand why that concern exists at all, you first have to understand the physical geography of the region itself. Because geography, not headlines, is what ultimately shapes military reality. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the narrowest and most strategically important maritime chokepoints on Earth. At its narrowest point, the strait is approximately 33 kilometers wide. But the actual designated shipping lanes used by large commercial tankers are far smaller, roughly 3 kilometers wide in each direction, separated by a narrow buffer zone. That detail matters more than most people realize, because confined geography changes military math. An aircraft carrier strike group is designed for layered defense across open ocean environments where distance creates reaction time. The Persian Gulf is not open ocean. It is a compressed operational environment surrounded by coastlines, islands, radar stations, missile sites, drone launch positions, and fast naval craft operating from multiple directions simultaneously. And the distances involved are remarkably short. From portions of the Iranian coastline to major shipping lanes, the distance can be less than 40 kilometers. For modern drones traveling between 150 and 300 kilometers per hour, that compresses warning and interception timelines dramatically. This is not speculation. It is physics. A drone launched from a concealed coastal position does not need to cross an ocean to create operational pressure. It only needs to force defensive systems to activate repeatedly over sustained periods of time. And here is where the geometry becomes even more important. Modern carrier strike groups rely on layered detection systems: airborne radar, shipborne radar, electronic surveillance, interceptor missiles, close-in weapon systems, and combat air patrols. These systems are extraordinarily capable against conventional threats, but they were largely optimized around tracking higher-value aircraft, missiles, or large-scale naval engagements. Not endless waves of inexpensive, low-signature unmanned systems approaching from multiple vectors. That distinction is critical, because every interception consumes resources. Every radar activation consumes attention. Every defensive maneuver affects operational tempo. Now add geography back into the equation. The Strait of Hormuz handles a significant percentage of globally traded oil shipments moving through an extremely confined corridor every single day. That means military operations inside this region are not occurring in isolation. Commercial shipping traffic, civilian vessels, patrol craft, surveillance drones, helicopters, and naval escorts are all operating inside the same compressed maritime space, which creates a dangerous reality. In confined waters, low-cost systems do not need to sink a carrier group to create strategic consequences. They only need to complicate movement, raise operational risk, and increase the economic cost of maintaining constant naval presence. And historically, chokepoints have always favored the side using asymmetry over the side relying on expensive concentration of force. Here is what most mainstream discussions tell you. Carrier strike groups remain the centerpiece of American naval dominance. Their layered missile defenses, airborne surveillance systems, escort destroyers, and nuclear-powered operational range make them among the most protected military assets ever constructed. That part is true. But here is what often gets omitted. Modern naval planners are increasingly being forced to confront a problem that has less to do with raw firepower and more to do with sustainability under continuous asymmetric pressure. Admiral James Stavridis, former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, publicly warned that inexpensive unmanned systems are changing naval warfare dramatically. Not theoretically, operationally. Rear Admiral Mark Dalton, speaking through U.S. Naval Institute discussions on drone warfare adaptation, described low-cost unmanned threats as persistent and scalable. That wording matters. Persistent, because a carrier strike group is optimized to project power. Not remain under endless low-cost harassment inside geographically compressed waters. And the geography of the Persian Gulf changes everything. Captain Brent Sadler, senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation and former U.S. Navy officer, noted that confined maritime environments reduce maneuver advantages. Again, that is not propaganda. It is physics. The Strait of Hormuz compresses some of the most advanced naval assets on Earth into narrow operational corridors surrounded by coastlines, islands, and heavily monitored maritime approaches. Now combine that environment with mass-produced drones, mobile launch systems, electronic warfare pressure, and repeated low-cost probing operations. The equation starts changing. According to Michael Knights, senior fellow at the Washington Institute specializing in Gulf security, Iran's doctrine emphasizes attritional pressure over decisive confrontation. Read that again slowly because the implications are serious. Attritional pressure. That means the objective is not necessarily immediate destruction. The objective is to increase operational cost, uncertainty, interception frequency, logistical strain, and strategic hesitation over time. And here is the piece many analysts are now connecting more openly. A single interceptor missile launched from advanced naval defense systems can cost dramatically more than the drone being intercepted. Under repeated engagement conditions, the financial ratio itself begins creating pressure. This is not a hidden conspiracy. The Pentagon has openly discussed concerns surrounding drone saturation and low-cost asymmetric systems across multiple operational theaters. But the broader implication is rarely assembled into one complete picture. Because once inexpensive unmanned systems can repeatedly force billion-dollar naval assets into reactive defensive cycles, the strategic balance begins shifting away from pure technological superiority and toward sustainability, geography, and economic endurance. And historically, military history shows that once cost asymmetry reaches a certain threshold, even dominant powers are forced to adapt their doctrine. But here is where it gets worse. Because this discussion stops being about drones the moment repeated low-cost pressure begins affecting strategic decision-making itself. And there are already signs of that shift emerging across multiple theaters. The first consequence is operational saturation. A carrier strike group can intercept drones. That is not the issue. The issue is what happens when naval defense systems are forced into repeated high-tempo defensive cycles over days, weeks, or months inside strategically compressed waters. Every interception consumes missiles. Every interception consumes maintenance cycles. Every interception consumes attention. And warfare at sea has always been partially a contest of endurance. Now add the second layer: commercial shipping. The Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most economically sensitive waterways on Earth. A significant portion of globally traded oil passes through this corridor every single day. That means even limited disruptions, elevated insurance risks, or persistent security alerts can begin affecting energy markets far beyond the Gulf itself. This is not hypothetical. Energy traders, shipping insurers, and global logistics firms already price geopolitical instability directly into operational costs. And that leads directly into the third consequence: economic pressure without direct confrontation. Because asymmetric systems allow regional actors to create strategic uncertainty without engaging in conventional large-scale naval warfare. The objective is not necessarily escalation into full conflict. The objective can simply be sustained unpredictability. That distinction changes everything. A drone does not need to sink a carrier to affect global markets. It only needs to force defensive recalculations often enough that the perception of risk begins spreading through shipping lanes, insurance systems, commodity pricing, and investor behavior simultaneously. Now here is the fourth layer most people still underestimate: replication. Cheap drone warfare is no longer isolated to one conflict zone or one military doctrine. The technologies are becoming cheaper, more mobile, more autonomous, and more globally accessible every year. Which means the strategic problem is spreading. And once low-cost asymmetric pressure becomes scalable across multiple regions at the same time, even the most advanced military platforms in the world are forced to confront a deeply uncomfortable reality. Dominance is one thing. Sustaining dominance economically over long periods of asymmetric pressure is something very different entirely. At this point, it is easy to look at all of this and assume it is simply another distant geopolitical confrontation unfolding thousands of miles away. It is not, because what happens inside strategic chokepoints like the Strait of Hormuz does not stay there for very long. A significant share of globally traded oil still moves through that narrow corridor every single day. That means even moderate instability, repeated drone incidents, or prolonged military tension can begin affecting energy pricing almost immediately. And once energy prices move, everything connected to transportation moves with them. Fuel, shipping, food distribution, manufacturing, heating costs, the entire chain starts reacting. That is the part many people underestimate about modern geopolitical risk. The economic effects often travel faster than the military ones. A drone launched near a shipping corridor in the Gulf can eventually influence freight costs on the other side of the world. Not because the drone itself is strategically decisive, but because uncertainty spreads through markets extremely quickly. Insurance companies raise premiums. Shipping firms reroute vessels. Energy traders adjust risk calculations. Governments begin preparing contingency measures. And ordinary households absorb the consequences gradually through higher costs. This is not fear-mongering. It is how interconnected global supply systems actually function. Read that again slowly because the implications are serious. When low-cost asymmetric systems can create even temporary uncertainty around critical maritime trade routes, the economic pressure extends far beyond military planners and defense analysts. It reaches grocery bills, transportation costs, utility prices, long-term inflation pressure. And this is precisely why naval strategists pay such close attention to asymmetric threats in confined waterways. The concern is not only military vulnerability. It is economic vulnerability, because the modern global economy depends heavily on predictable movement, predictable shipping, predictable energy flows, predictable supply chains. And asymmetric warfare is specifically designed to disrupt predictability. That is why this discussion matters far beyond defense circles. The question is no longer whether drone warfare can create tactical complications. The question now is how many sectors of everyday life become exposed once those complications begin affecting the arteries of the global economy itself. At this point, there are two realistic paths forward. And the uncomfortable reality is that both are already developing at the same time. The first path is adaptation. Under this scenario, major naval powers successfully adjust to the rise of low-cost asymmetric warfare. Defensive systems become cheaper, interception technology becomes more scalable, electronic warfare improves, and autonomous counter-drone platforms begin reducing the financial imbalance that currently favors inexpensive unmanned systems. In other words, the economics stabilize. Carrier groups remain strategically dominant, but their doctrine evolves. More distributed operations, greater unmanned integration, wider defensive perimeters, faster interception cycles, less dependence on expensive missile responses for every incoming threat. That future is entirely possible, and many defense planners are already moving in that direction. But here is the second path. The cost imbalance continues widening faster than adaptation can keep pace. Cheap drones become more autonomous, more precise, more numerous, more difficult to track consistently across crowded maritime environments. And suddenly the objective of asymmetric warfare is no longer battlefield victory in the traditional sense. It becomes strategic exhaustion, repeated low-cost pressure, persistent uncertainty, constant interception cycles, economic strain layered over military strain. Now place that dynamic inside globally critical chokepoints like the Strait of Hormuz, the Red Sea, or the South China Sea. The implications expand rapidly. Shipping costs rise, insurance markets tighten, energy volatility increases, military deployments become more expensive to sustain indefinitely. And here is the part that defense analysts increasingly debate quietly but seriously. What happens if low-cost saturation tactics spread faster than major powers can economically defend against them? Because history shows that military competition is not always decided by who possesses the most advanced systems. Sometimes it is decided by who can sustain operational pressure the longest without exhausting financial, industrial, or political endurance. That is not a prediction. It is a historical pattern. The real question is whether modern military doctrine can adapt quickly enough before the economics of asymmetric warfare begin reshaping global power projection in ways few governments are fully prepared for yet. For decades, military power was measured primarily by size, speed, technological superiority, and the ability to project overwhelming force across entire regions. But asymmetric warfare is beginning to challenge that equation in ways that many governments are still struggling to fully absorb. Not because advanced systems suddenly stopped working, but because the economics surrounding those systems may be changing faster than the doctrine built around them. And historically, that is where strategic transitions often begin. Not with one catastrophic battle, not with one dramatic headline, but with a gradual realization that the cost of maintaining dominance is increasing faster than expected while the barriers to disruption are becoming dramatically cheaper. That is the deeper issue underneath this entire discussion. Because a low-cost drone forcing repeated defensive reactions from billion-dollar naval infrastructure is not just a tactical story. It is a signal a signal that warfare may be entering another period where adaptability matters as much as raw technological advantage. Now, one final point deserves careful attention. None of this means aircraft carriers suddenly become obsolete. That conclusion would be simplistic and inaccurate. Carrier strike groups remain among the most powerful military platforms ever created, and no low-cost system alone replaces the global operational reach they provide. But the strategic debate surrounding sustainability, interception economics, and asymmetric pressure is clearly intensifying. And the countries studying that imbalance most carefully are not only watching the Persian Gulf. They are watching the Red Sea, the South China Sea, the Black Sea, the Arctic, because once low-cost unmanned systems begin reshaping operational thinking in one choke point, military planners immediately start asking where the same logic could appear next. That is the question increasingly shaping modern naval strategy. And it is also the question we are going to continue exploring. Because in the next video, we are going to examine how drone saturation tactics in the Red Sea are already forcing changes in global shipping behavior, insurance pricing, and naval deployment strategy in ways most people still have not connected fully. The math is changing, the doctrine is adapting, and the next chapter is already being written.